Hi, I'm Gert Hengeveld, a full-stack software engineer at Chromatic. Chromatic was founded by Storybook maintainers and provides a platform for visual regression testing and review on top of it. I work for my home in the Netherlands, and because Storybook is open source, a lot of my work is out there in the open. Of course, you can follow me on Twitter for the occasional update on UI development and best practices. Today, I'm excited to show you something I've been working on for the past couple of months. But first, let's cover the basics. These days, user interfaces are built using components. All modern frameworks provide a way to do component-driven development. Even server frameworks like Ruby on Rails now provide a way to build and use components. This makes sense because component-driven development brings a lot of benefits. You can work more efficiently because not every piece of UI has to be custom made. You can speed up development by parallelizing work across people and teams. And user interfaces become more durable as you put more thought into component APIs by working on them in isolation. Despite efforts by framework authors to lower the barrier to creating great user interfaces, testing them is still hard to do right. Testing against a running app can be slow and flaky, and reproducing an error is hard. Complex business logic means there's tons of scenarios and states to consider, which you can't possibly test manually, especially when your UI is in constant development. Existing test tools also leave a lot to be desired. If you think about it, it's silly how the status quo is to run unit tests with JS DOM, which is a totally different environment than the one your user interface will end up running in, or that you have to install a separate browser to run and debug your interaction tests. In case you're not familiar with Storybook yet, it's a tool to build UI components. It provides a clean room environment for your components so you can focus on the way they work and look in all of their states and variants. It works with all major front-end frameworks. Storybook is primarily built to run on your local machine, alongside your project code as you develop or test applications. But you can also upload a static version of it to share with colleagues or customers. Storybook can be extended with hundreds of add-ons to integrate with design tools like Figma or hookup components to a data source, render components like a colorblind person would see them, or generate component documentation. It's the single source of truth for UI components. When you work in Storybook, you'll be building components in isolation. Storybook provides a canvas on which it will render your component. In a typical workflow, you'll run your Storybook alongside your code editor. Storybook is all about cataloging component variants and categorizing components to form an organized, searchable component library. This will help everyone find the components they need, making it easier to reuse what's already there. Storybook is an open source project powered by a large community of contributors, and it's trusted by thousands of development teams around the world. It's used at companies like Shopify, GitHub, IBM, and the BBC. It's even popping up on people's resumes more and more. Storybook's main innovation is the concept of stories. Most UI components have more than one variation. A story is a piece of code that renders a component in one such variation. Think of things like loading states, error states, and functional states such as a toggle. But there's also edge cases like extreme values, overflowing content, or missing data. And finally, there's context-dependent variations such as whether a user is signed in or not, their language, whether they prefer a dark theme, or what their assigned variant is in an A/B test. And to make matters worse, there's also countless possible combinations. Certainly not something you want to test manually. Stories are defined using Component Story Format, or CSF for short. It's an open specification supported not just by Storybook, but by many other tools. This means you can write stories once and reuse them in various places. There's no API lock-in because you're simply writing vanilla JavaScript. You can totally use stories with Playwright or Cypress if you want. Now, let's dive into some code. Here's what a simple stories file for a badge component looks like. At the top, we import the component and define a metadata object. This is the default export. This object can be used to define things like the type of data this component needs, where it goes in the component hierarchy, specify default arguments, and wrap the component with a data provider. In this case, we only need to tell Storybook which component we're rendering, and we're also specifying a default label. The badge component has a small and a large variant, so we define two stories, small and large, which only differ in their size property. To write a story, really all it takes is a plain JavaScript object. Now that you know how to define stories, we can add interactions. Sometimes a component has variants which cannot be expressed by passing arguments alone. Maybe you can't or don't want to change the API of the component, or the component is nested inside of another component, such as a page. Either way, passing args may not be an option. A lot of people struggled with this. And that's why Storybook 6.4 introduces interactive stories. In Storybook 6.4, you can define a play function on your stories which runs immediately after your component renders. This allows you to create stories for complex components and pages. For example, you can simulate user behavior using the highly popular testing library. These interactions run in the browser, so you're actually able to see and inspect the result. There's even an ESLint plugin to help you write play functions without stepping into some common pitfalls. Beyond running interactive stories, we're also working on interaction testing. In the coming months, we will release tools to make assertions in your play functions. The Interactions add-on will enable you to interactively debug your tests right there in your browser. The great thing about using testing library with Storybook is that it runs your regular browser, which means you can use the dev tools you know and love, and you won't need to install any extra software. Using the Node.js test runner, you'll be able to run the entire Storybook as a test suite, and when something fails, you'll get a URL with which to reproduce the error. Now, let's take a look at how this works in practice with some live coding. Alright, so I've set up a simple component for an account form with a storage file. And what I want to do now is write some stories for the filled state. So let's go ahead and do that. Export const filled, and it's just a plain object. It has a play function on it, which is always an asynchronous function. So what we want to do here is write some interactions against the running component in Storybook. In order to do that, we first need to get a hold of the canvas element so that we can target our selectors against that container. So that's passed on the story context that the play function receives, canvas element, and we can then use a utility from testing library to get a scoped selector. Import within from Storybook/testing library. And now const canvas equals within that canvas element. Right, so let's save our file and see if we get a new story. So in Storybook, new story has appeared, but it doesn't do anything special yet. Right? We haven't done anything. So let's continue to write some interactions. To do that, we need user event from testing library. And we say await user event dot type, because we want to type into this input field, and well, now we need to provide an element. So how do we get a hold of that input box? Well, what's great is you can just use your browser's regular dev tools here to inspect element. Right? And we can see that this input has a data test ID, which I can just copy and paste, get me that thing, and then say canvas get by test ID, not get all, just get that one by test ID, email, and of course provide a value, hello. Save my file, and boom, Storybook has instantly re-rendered my component, filled in the form, and also listed that thing in the interactions panel. Let's do the same thing for the password. Password, hello world, of course. Save my file, boom, we have two interactions here. We can actually hover over these things, click them to see what's going on at that particular step. You can step back and forth between interactions. So let's see what happens when I click that create account button. Boom, it errors, of course, right? I didn't actually fill in a valid email address and the password isn't long enough, right? So let's actually write a story for this particular state of my component, right? Because this is a totally valid state that people can encounter and we want to write a story for it. So export const invalid is a new story, and it's going to take a play function, of course, and again an async function. And instead of repeating myself here, I'm just going to use the previous story play function. So I need to await that build.play, and the play function needs a story context. So that context I will pass along and save my file, and I should have a new story. Click it, boom, same thing, nothing's different, right? Same story. Now let's extend it. Again, I need a canvas. Canvas element, and now I can do await user event click, because I want to click that button to trigger the invalid state. Canvas get by role button. Save my file, see what happens. Boom, it errored. Well, it found multiple buttons on the page because of course there's also a reset button here, so we need to specify exactly which one we want. Save, and boom, it works. So now we have a story for this invalid state. Let's take a closer look here. There's this error message and it has this tooltip. Let's extend this particular story to also show the tooltip on hover. We can totally do that using user event. User event dot hover. And now I don't know again which component, which element I need. So inspect element, and there's a test ID on it. Copy it and do canvas get by test ID. Pass it in, save my file, and it errored. Well, what's going on here? So this is a particular issue with writing tests for interactive elements, especially if they have any asynchronous process in there. In this case, asynchronous form validation. So after clicking the button, it takes a very short while for that error message to appear. And so I need to use a different query here, different type of query. And luckily, user event provides, or actually testing library provides a different selector to do that. Find by test ID, which is an asynchronous thing, so you need to await it. save the file, and now it works. So you'll see the story is updated and it has actually opened that tooltip, which means the hover worked. Right, now let's go ahead and actually write a story for the submitted state, right? So what I'm going to do is export const submitted, new story. And I'm just going to copy the play function from the first one and correct my mistakes. Great, I'm also going to submit, click the button, save it, I have a new story, and boom. As soon as I open it, it submitted the form and it's done, right? What we actually want to do now is verify that it worked, right? That don't just end at the button click, verify that it worked using a test. And to do that, we are going to use expect from jest. So I'm gonna import that, import expect from Storybook jest. Again, we need the Storybook wrapper for jest here because that is an instrumented version that will work with the interactions add-on. So what we can assert here is the fact that an action was triggered, because what happens when the button gets clicked, this onSubmit handler gets invoked, and that's something that we can assert on using expect. So await expect, and then we can assert on the args, and args are passed along to the play function. So I'm going to say args.onSubmit to have been called. Save my file and let's see what happens. It hasn't been called. Again, this is because there's some asynchronous validation in place, right? So before the onSubmit handler is called, it takes a little while. In this case, we can fix that using the wait for utility in the testing library. Wait for, which takes a function, a callback function actually. And now I save my file, and now it works. All right, let's recap what we've seen. A play function is just a property on your Storybook, and it allows you to run interactions and make assertions against your component. In order to use the interactions add-on, you'll have to use the Storybook wrappers for jest and testing library. This code really doesn't deviate much from the way you may already be using testing library or a similar tool. We've designed it to stand on the shoulders of giants while bringing more power and better user experience. By now, you may be wondering how we pull this off. It may feel like magic, but really, we're doing runtime introspection and interception. Since we build on top of testing library and jest, these libraries are instrumented to work with the interactions add-on. At runtime, method invocations are tracked and sent to the add-on panel to show a log of interactions. Then, when you're stepping back and forth with the debugger, rather than invoking the library method, it returns a promise, which won't resolve until you hit next. Finally, to prematurely break out of the play function, we throw exceptions which are silently ignored by Storybook. That may sound like a bad thing, but it is the trick to make it all work. So, how does this integrate with CI? For that, we'll be releasing a Node.js test runner that runs all play functions in your Storybook using a headless browser. And when something breaks, you can review failures in your regular browser or send a report to other tools. In a way, stories have always been like tests in Storybook. With the interactions add-on, we're only taking it to the next level, and we're just getting started. Thanks for listening, and please follow me on Twitter if you'd like to get updates on this. If you have any questions, please come find me in my Q&A session.